I am Jelena, 35 years old, and until last month I was the compliance director at Technova. After 3 years of watching ethical corners get cut, I found myself escorted out by security. Marcus chuckled as he fired me, saying my title was always just for show. What he never expected was that one text from me containing a single date would collapse their $90 million deal in seconds. The lead investor simply said, "Kill the wire," and their future imploded. Before I share how I stood up against corporate fraud, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and hit that subscribe button if you believe in workplace accountability. Ready to see how one person with integrity can take down a house of cards? My journey into the world of corporate compliance was not an accident. After completing my MBA with a focus on financial regulations, I spent 7 years building my reputation at respected firms like Morgan Stanley and Deloitte. I specialized in healthcare regulatory frameworks, an increasingly complex field where even small compliance failures could result in massive fines and lost licenses. My career was defined by attention to detail and unwavering ethical standards. When Technova approached me with the opportunity to build their compliance department from scratch, the offer felt like a perfect fit for my expertise. Technova was the rising star in health technology, with a platform that promised to revolutionize patient care coordination between hospitals, clinics, and insurance providers. Their proprietary algorithms claimed to reduce administrative costs by 30% while improving patient outcomes. The company had already secured Series A and B funding rounds totaling $45 million and was growing at a breakneck pace when I joined. Marcus Brooks, the CEO, personally recruited me. With his Stanford background and infectious enthusiasm, Marcus painted a vision of building the most trusted name in healthcare technology. During my interviews, he emphasized how critical compliance would be to their long-term success, saying all the right things about ethical business practices. "We want to do this right from the ground up," Jelena, Marcus, told me during our final interview, his blue eyes intense with conviction. "Too many tech companies treat regulation as an afterthought. We need someone who will be our conscience as we scale." The leadership team I joined initially seemed aligned with this mission. Diana Reed, the CFO, had a background in healthcare finance and understood the complex regulatory landscape. In our early meetings, she would often defer to my expertise on compliance matters, reinforcing my authority with the team. Ryan Parker, the COO, was more operationally focused, but generally responsive when I flagged potential issues. My first 6 months at Technova were exhilarating. I built systems, implemented training programs, and developed compliance protocols that integrated with their rapid development cycles. The company culture was energetic, with catered lunches, meditation rooms, and the typical Silicon Valley perks. The average employee age was 29, and most seemed genuinely passionate about improving healthcare. I quickly bonded with Samantha Torres from the legal department. Unlike many of the younger employees, Samantha had worked at established healthcare companies and understood the real-world implications of regulatory shortcuts. Over lunch one day, she confided, "I am so glad they hired you. The growth is exciting, but I have been worried about how fast we are moving without proper guardrails." Jackson Miller, the product director, was the first person who triggered my internal warning system. Brilliant but impatient, Jackson viewed compliance requirements as bureaucratic obstacles to innovation. In product meetings, he would often make comments like, "Can we just implement this feature now and sort out the compliance stuff later?" or "Our competitors are not waiting for permission slips." The first notable tension emerged around month 8, when I discovered the engineering team had implemented a feature allowing doctors to share patient case details without proper consent mechanisms. When I raised this as a potential HIPAA violation, Jackson rolled his eyes visibly during the meeting. "Every minute we spend adding friction to the user experience costs us market share," he argued. "Doctors need to collaborate without jumping through hoops." Marcus sided with Jackson, instructing me to find a workable solution that would not slow down the release. The compromise we reached technically satisfied the letter of the law, but certainly not its spirit. It was my first experience of what would become a pattern compliance as an afterthought, a box to check rather than a guiding principle. As Technova prepared for its Series C funding round, I noticed Marcus increasingly referring to me as our compliance director in investor meetings, emphasizing the company's commitment to regulatory rigor. Yet simultaneously, my team remained understaffed, and my recommendations were frequently overruled in private. The company secured its $60 million Series C, round 14 months after I joined with the lead investor, specifically mentioning robust compliance infrastructure as a key differentiator from competitors. The night of the celebration party, Diana pulled me aside with a glass of champagne. "You helped make this happen, Jelena," she said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "The investors love knowing we have someone with your credentials watching the store." Something in her tone made me uneasy. It sounded less like appreciation for my work and more like acknowledgement of my role in a performance put on for investors. That night marked a subtle but significant shift in my understanding of my position at Teknova. I was beginning to see that perhaps my title and credentials mattered more to the company than my actual function. As the company rapidly expanded post-Series C, opening offices in 3 new cities and doubling headcount to 400 employees, the culture began to transform. The intimate startup atmosphere gave way to corporate hierarchies and decision-making became less transparent. Marcus became increasingly distant, surrounded by an inner circle that included Diana Jackson and a few senior engineers. "Move fast and apologize later" became an unofficial company mantra, whispered in hallways when regulatory concerns were raised. With each passing month, I found myself more frequently excluded from strategic discussions where my input should have been essential. Meetings would be rescheduled at the last minute without notifying me, or decisions would be made and announced before I could assess compliance implications. By the end of my second year, I had a growing file of concerns documented in emails that received minimal or delayed responses. The realization was becoming inescapable. My role at Teknova was not to ensure actual compliance, but to serve as a symbol of compliance for investors, partners, and potential acquirers. I was window dressing for a company that prioritized growth at all costs. The first major red flag appeared when I discovered our data science team was using anonymized patient information for purposes beyond what our privacy agreement specified. Teknova had partnerships with 15 major hospital systems giving us access to millions of patient records. Our contracts explicitly limited data usage to improving our core service offering, but I found evidence the team was using this valuable dataset to develop new, unrelated products. When I brought this to Diana's attention, she dismissed my concerns with surprising casualness. "The data is anonymized, Jelena. No one can trace it back to individual patients," she said, barely looking up from her laptop. "That is not the issue," I explained. "We are contractually bound to use this data only for specific purposes. Developing new products falls outside those boundaries." Diana finally looked at me, her expression a mixture of impatience and condescension. "These contracts have plenty of interpretive flexibility. Our legal team does not see an issue." What troubled me most was that I led the compliance team that should have reviewed such interpretations, yet this determination had been made without my involvement. When I later spoke with Samantha about it, she confirmed my suspicions. "Legal never reviewed this specific use case," she whispered, glancing around the coffee shop where we had met off campus. "Someone above my pay grade must have made that call." The next incident involved a major pharmaceutical company partnership worth $20 million annually. Teknova was providing a platform for tracking patient medication adherence with financial incentives tied to improved compliance rates. During implementation, I discovered the metrics being used would systematically overstate adherence by counting partial adherence as full compliance. I drafted a detailed memo outlining how this methodology could be considered misleading under FDA guidelines for pharmaceutical marketing claims. 3 days after submitting it to Marcus and the executive team, I was informed the implementation would proceed as planned. "The client understands and approves our methodology," Marcus told me in a terse email. "This matter is resolved." When quarterly reports began showing 97% patient compliance against industry averages of 60%, I knew we were presenting fundamentally misleading data. The sick feeling in my stomach grew stronger each time these statistics were highlighted in company presentations. My growing concerns extended to financial reporting preparations as well. As Teknova prepared quarterly updates for existing investors, I noticed a pattern of selective disclosure. Successful metrics were prominently featured, while less favorable indicators were buried in footnotes or omitted entirely. Customer churn calculations mysteriously excluded certain provisional clients who had discontinued service. During one preparation meeting for the quarterly investor update, I raised concerns about how we were presenting customer acquisition costs. "The way we are allocating marketing expenses gives a misleading picture of our unit economics," I pointed out. "Some significant costs are being classified as one-time expenses when they are clearly ongoing operational costs." Diana exchanged a glance with Marcus before responding. These accounting decisions were reviewed by our external auditors. We appreciate your vigilance, Jelena, but this falls outside compliance purview. The boundary of what constituted compliance purview seemed to shrink with each passing month. Increasingly, I found myself deliberately excluded from strategic meetings where critical decisions were made. Calendar invites would be rescinded last minute, with vague explanations about focusing the discussion or postponements that never materialized for me. The most troubling incident came when I accidentally received an email chain intended for the executive team minus myself. The discussion concerned preparation for a board presentation on regulatory milestones containing bullet points significantly misrepresenting our compliance status with several healthcare regulations. The company was claiming full implementation of security protocols that were at best partially deployed. I requested a private meeting with Marcus to address these discrepancies, which he finally granted after 3 reschedulings. When I entered his glass-walled office, he remained seated, scrolling through his phone for nearly a full minute before acknowledging me. "I know you have concerns, Jelena, but I need team players right now," he said, before I could even begin. "The board needs confidence as we approach Series D, not nitpicking." "This is not nitpicking, Marcus. We are making claims to the board that expose us to significant liability," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with cool detachment. "Do you know what the board cares about? Growth? Market penetration? Becoming indispensable before competitors catch up." He gestured to the city skyline visible from his corner office. "Everything else is just details we can fix later when we have secured market dominance." That evening I witnessed firsthand how Marcus deliberately misled the board during their virtual meeting. From my position at the conference table, I watched him confidently assert that all regulatory frameworks were fully implemented and validated, while looking directly at me, daring me to contradict him in front of the board members. I remained silent, a decision that would haunt me for weeks afterward. My role increasingly felt performative, existing primarily so Marcus could tell investors and partners, "Our compliance director has reviewed and approved this approach." Except, increasingly, I had done no such thing. My actual concerns were systematically sidelined or ignored. The personal toll began mounting. I started experiencing insomnia, waking at 3 a.m. with anxiety about being complicit in ethical breaches. My friends noticed I had become withdrawn, constantly checking my phone for work emails, even during social gatherings. My doctor noted elevated blood pressure during my annual physical and suggested stress management techniques. Samantha became my only true ally within the company. During our regular coffee meetings away from the office, she would slip me copies of documents that concerned her, or update me on discussions I had been excluded from. Her position in legal gave her access to information that increasingly never made it to my desk. "They are being careful about what crosses your desk now," she told me during one of our off-site meetings. "Anything sensitive gets verbal approval, only no email trail." Following her tip, I began meticulously documenting everything, creating a personal record of each concerning incident, conversation, and decision. I noted dates, participants, and exact quotes whenever possible. This documentation became both my insurance policy and my proof that I had not been complicit in the company's increasingly questionable practices. What I did not realize then was how crucial this record would become, not just for my peace of mind, but for what would ultimately unfold when everything came crashing down. The situation at Teknova deteriorated rapidly after I discovered falsified clinical trial data in investor presentations. Our flagship product included an algorithm claiming to predict patient readmission risk with 93% accuracy validated through independent clinical trials. While reviewing materials for an upcoming investor meeting, I noticed discrepancies between the raw trial data and the results being presented. The actual accuracy rate was 78%, significantly lower than claimed. Moreover, the trials had been conducted internally with cherry-picked test cases, not independently, as stated in presentations. This was not merely an exaggeration. It was a material misrepresentation that could constitute securities fraud. I immediately scheduled an emergency meeting with Marcus and Diana, bringing comprehensive documentation of the discrepancies. The conference room tension was palpable as I laid out my findings. "This presentation claims 93% accuracy from independent trials," I said, placing the slides next to my analysis. "The actual data shows 78% from internal testing only. We cannot present this to investors." Marcus remained unnervingly calm. The 93% reflects our latest algorithm improvements that have not yet been fully documented. The independent validation is in process. Then we need to clearly label these as preliminary internal findings, not verified results, I insisted. Diana shook her head. That would unnecessarily complicate the narrative when we know the final results will validate these numbers. You cannot know that, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain professional. And even if you believe it, we cannot present assumptions as completed facts to investors. Marcus stood, signaling the meeting was over. Thank you for your input, Jelena. We will make some language adjustments before the presentation. He left without further discussion, taking my documentation with him. The presentation went forward the following week. The only change was semantic independently validated became independently validated methodology, a meaningless modifier that still conveyed false certainty to investors. I was not invited to attend. Shortly after, I discovered another serious issue: financial projections being shown to potential Series D investors contained misleading revenue forecasts. The projections assumed a 100% conversion rate from pilot programs to full contracts and included revenue from partnerships that were still in preliminary discussion stages. I drafted a formal memo outlining the legal risks of such projections, including potential violations of SEC regulations regarding forward-looking statements. I sent the memo directly to Marcus, Diana, and the board's audit committee, hoping the escalation would finally trigger appropriate concern. 3 days later, I received a terse email from Diana. Your memo has been reviewed. The projections include appropriate disclaimers and risk factors. Matter closed. When I checked with the board secretary, I learned my memo had never been forwarded to the audit committee. My attempts to speak directly with board members were systematically blocked. Meeting requests were denied. Emails went unanswered, and Marcus explicitly instructed me not to contact board members, directly citing proper communication protocols. As Series D funding preparation accelerated, compliance shortcuts multiplied. Required security audits were abbreviated. Penetration testing was conducted by friendly firms, giving predetermined results, and customer testimonials were edited to remove qualifying language about product limitations. The situation came to a head during an executive meeting discussing Series D preparation. 12 people sat around the conference table reviewing final materials for investor presentations. When the discussion turned to regulatory compliance, I raised concerns about claims regarding our HIPAA compliance status. We are stating full HIPAA compliance, but 3 of our data centers have not completed required security certifications, I explained. We should qualify this statement until those certifications are complete. Marcus fixed me with a cold stare. Jelena, we have discussed this privately already. The certifications are formalities at this point. They are legal requirements, not formalities, I countered. Marcus's expression hardened. Perhaps if your team had processed the paperwork more efficiently, we would not be having this conversation. But since you bring it up here, let me be clear for everyone's benefit. He looked around the table. The compliance function exists to facilitate business operations, not obstruct them with technicalities. If you cannot align with that priority, perhaps we should reevaluate your role. The room fell silent. I felt my face flush with humiliation as colleagues averted their eyes. Marcus had publicly undermined my authority and effectively threatened my job in front of the entire executive team. The message was unmistakable. Compliance concerns were unwelcome if they threatened the funding timeline. Following this incident, I began even more meticulously documenting everything with timestamps and witnesses. Each questionable decision, every overruled recommendation, all instances where my team was bypassed, I recorded them with clinical precision. Samantha continued providing copies of altered documents, showing how presentations changed after compliance review, creating a paper trail of systematic disregard for regulatory requirements. The most disturbing revelation came when Samantha slipped me documents showing backdated regulatory approvals. Technova had implemented significant platform changes, affecting patient data handling months before receiving required healthcare privacy certifications. Rather than disclosing this sequence, documentation had been altered to suggest approvals were obtained before implementation. They backdated these by over 3 months, Samantha whispered during our coffee meeting. If regulators discovered this during an audit, it would trigger massive penalties and possibly criminal charges, I finished. The stress was taking an increasing personal toll. I developed persistent headaches and began experiencing panic attacks for the first time in my life. My relationship with my boyfriend became strained as I found myself unable to discuss work frustrations but equally unable to leave them at the office. After one particularly tense weekend where I spent most of my time distracted by work concerns, he commented that I seemed like a different person since taking the Technova position. My health deteriorated further when I began experiencing chest pains that sent me to the emergency room, convinced I was having a heart attack. The diagnosis was acute anxiety, but the episode terrified me. The doctor asked pointed questions about workplace stress, recommending I consider whether my job was worth the physical toll. 2 weeks before the scheduled Series D investor presentations, Ryan Parker, the COO, asked to meet me for coffee away from the office. Though never a close ally, Ryan had generally been professional in our interactions. At a small cafe 3 blocks from Technova, he spoke in hushed tones. "I wanted to give you a heads up," he said, checking to ensure no one from the company was nearby. "Marcus plans to replace you after the Series D funding is secured. They already have candidates lined up, more flexible people from their perspective." "I am not surprised," I replied, my stomach nodding, despite having suspected as much. "Thank you for telling me." Ryan looked uncomfortable. "There is more. If any compliance issues arise after funding, the narrative is already being shaped to place responsibility on you. They are documenting instances where you supposedly approved approaches you actually objected to." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was being set up as the future scapegoat. If regulators or investors ever questioned Technova's practices, the company would claim the compliance director had failed in her duties. My termination would be framed as the company addressing these failures, rather than silencing a dissenting voice. That night, reviewing my meticulously maintained records, I came to a sobering conclusion. I was not merely witnessing unethical behavior. I was being maneuvered into a position where I could be legally implicated in it. My choices were narrowing: become complicit, be framed, or take a stand that would likely end my career at Technova. Little did I know, events would soon force this decision, in the most dramatic way possible. The morning started like any other. I arrived at the office at 7:30, reviewed overnight emails, and prepared for a 9 o'clock meeting with my small compliance team. Nothing indicated it would be my last day at Technova. At 10:15, my phone rang. It was Marcus's executive assistant, her voice carefully neutral. "Marcus would like to see you in his office immediately." When I arrived, I found not just Marcus but also Diana, and a man I recognized as Lawrence Patel from Human Resources. Marcus did not invite me to sit. "Jelena, we have decided to make some organizational changes effective." Immediately, Marcus began without preamble. His tone was businesslike, but there was an unmistakable gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "We are eliminating your position and restructuring the compliance function under legal." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "We appreciate your contributions, but as we scale towards Series D and beyond, we need a different approach to compliance. More integrated, more business-minded." He glanced at Diana, who nodded slightly. "I see," I said carefully. "May I ask about the timing? The Series D presentations are next week, and there are several compliance certifications still in process." Marcus's mouth curved into what could almost be called a smile. "That is precisely why this transition makes sense now. We need to present a streamlined operation to investors." Then came the statement that would later prove so damning. "Let's be honest, Jelena. Your compliance director title was always just for show." He actually chuckled as he said it. "It gave investors comfort, but we need people who understand business realities, not just regulatory idealism." The casual cruelty of his dismissal momentarily stunned me. In that moment, he had confirmed everything I had suspected, but could never prove my role had been window dressing. My expertise ignored by design, my concerns dismissed as irrelevant to the company's true priorities. Diana spoke next, her voice professionally sympathetic, but her eyes cold. "We have already identified a transition candidate who better understands our growth objectives. Lawrence will walk you through the separation details." Lawrence slid a document across the table. "This outlines the severance package, which includes 4 weeks of pay contingent upon signing our standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements. We will need your company laptop and access card before you leave today." My mind raced. 4 weeks of severance for 3 years of work contingent on my silence. The insulting offer crystallized everything wrong with Technova's culture. "When do I have time to transition my ongoing projects?" I asked, playing for time while processing what was happening. That will not be necessary, Marcus replied. As I mentioned, we have someone ready to step in who already understands our approach. Translation: someone who would rubber stamp whatever the executives wanted without ethical objections. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, Lawrence added. Company policy for departing executives. The humiliation of being marched through the office by security guards was clearly by design, a public demonstration of my fall from grace, and a warning to others who might raise inconvenient truths. As I was escorted to my office, I saw colleagues watching with mixtures of shock, embarrassment, and in some cases visible relief that it was me and not them. I was allowed 15 minutes to collect personal belongings under supervision. Photos, a few books, the degree certificate hanging on my wall. My computer had already been locked, and my email access terminated while I was in Marcus's office. 3 years of professional life reduced to a small cardboard box carried out under guard like a criminal. In the lobby, I handed over my access card. The security guard, someone I had greeted every morning for years, could not meet my eyes. Your remaining personal items will be shipped to your home address, he mumbled, holding the door open. Just like that, I was standing on the sidewalk outside Technova headquarters, unemployed and in shock. The spring sunshine felt incongruously bright for such a dark moment in my professional life. I stood frozen for several minutes, clutching my sad little box of belongings as employees hurried past, carefully avoiding eye contact. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Shock gave way to rage, then to crushing self-doubt. Had I been too rigid, too focused on technical compliance rather than business realities? Should I have found more diplomatic ways to raise concerns without becoming labeled as an obstacle? Sleep proved impossible. I would lie awake replaying every interaction, every warning sign, every moment I could have perhaps changed the outcome. During daylight hours, I alternated between frantically updating my resume and lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, questioning every career choice that had led me to this point. My boyfriend tried to be supportive, but clearly did not understand the professional devastation I was experiencing. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise, he suggested. You have been miserable there for months. While technically true, his attempt at comfort only highlighted how completely my identity had become entangled with my professional role. Who was I if not the principled compliance expert? What was my value if my expertise could be so casually dismissed? 3 days after my termination, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my apartment. Inside was a formal letter from Technova's external counsel, outlining in threatening legal language my continuing obligations regarding confidentiality. The letter specifically emphasized that any communication with Technova investors, partners, or regulators could constitute tortious interference with business relationships and result in legal action. The message was clear: stay silent or face ruinous litigation. The letter felt less like a standard reminder of contractual obligations and more like a personalized threat. They were worried enough about what I might say to have their attorneys specifically warn me against saying it. A week into my unemployment, my sister Angela visited from Chicago, concerned after our phone conversations. Her outside perspective provided the first real clarity I had experienced since the firing. You sound like someone recovering from an abusive relationship, she observed as we shared a bottle of wine in my living room. You keep questioning yourself when it is obvious they were the problem, not you. But maybe I could have found a better way to navigate it, I said. Been more strategic, less confrontational. Angela shook her head firmly. Jelena, listen to yourself. They were engaging in fraudulent behavior and punished you for doing your job. There is no better way to handle fraud except to call it what it island. Her words penetrated the fog of self-doubt. She was right. I had done exactly what I was hired to do, what my professional ethics required. The fault lay with Technova's leadership, not with my performance. The following day, I contacted an employment attorney recommended by a former colleague. Patricia Winters specialized in wrongful termination cases involving financial and healthcare companies. In her understated office, I laid out the complete timeline of my Technova experience. They have clearly created a hostile work environment for attempting to perform your regulatory duties, Patricia said after reviewing my documentation. Unfortunately, your legal options are somewhat limited. Whistleblower protections typically kick in after you have reported violations to appropriate authorities, not before. What about wrongful termination, I asked. California's at-will employment laws make that challenging without clear evidence of discrimination based on protected characteristics, she explained. Your strongest claim might be retaliation for refusing to participate in unlawful conduct, but those cases are difficult and expensive to litigate against well-funded companies. Her assessment was sobering but realistic. Taking on Technova legally would be a David versus Goliath battle with uncertain prospects and guaranteed personal cost. As I was leaving Patricia's office, my phone chimed with a text from Samantha Series D final presentation to lead investors scheduled for next Thursday via video conference. Marcus rehearsing today, looking very confident. A quick internet search confirmed that Westlake Ventures was leading the $90 million Series D round, with several other prominent firms participating. Technova was being valued at over $700 million pre-money, a valuation built partly on misrepresentations I had documented, but failed to stop. That night I faced the central moral dilemma that would define the next chapter of my life: remain silent, as investors were potentially defrauded of millions based on misrepresentations I had documented, or speak up and risk legal retaliation from a company with vastly greater resources than my own. As I reviewed my detailed records one more time, the weight of the decision settled heavily on my shoulders. This was no longer just about my career or reputation. Real people would make investment decisions based on information I knew to be false. Healthcare providers would implement systems with exaggerated capabilities. Patients might ultimately be affected by algorithms that did not perform as claimed. The ethical turning point came when I found myself mentally drafting the testimony I might one day have to give if these issues eventually came to light. Yes, I knew the claims were false. No, I did not inform anyone after my termination. Yes, I was afraid of legal consequences. In that moment, I knew I could not live with that version of myself. Whatever the personal cost, I could not remain silent while fraud was perpetrated on my watch, even if that watch had officially ended. The question was not whether to act, but how to do so effectively, and with minimal legal exposure to myself. With the Series D funding call less than a week away, I needed to be methodical. I spent an entire day reviewing all the evidence I had collected over months of growing concern at Technova. My documentation was extensive emails, meeting notes, copies of presentations before and after my reviews, and detailed records of conversations where my concerns were dismissed. The most compelling evidence centered around three key misrepresentations. First, the clinical accuracy claims for the readmission prediction algorithm, where marketing materials claimed 93% accuracy from independent validation, when internal testing showed 78% at best. Second, the financial projections showing customer acquisition costs 50% lower than actual figures achieved by reclassifying ongoing expenses as one-time costs. Third, and perhaps most damning, the backdated regulatory compliance certifications that made it appear Technova had obtained necessary approvals before implementing changes to patient data handling protocols. While reviewing this third item, my phone rang just after midnight. It was Samantha, her voice tight with stress. "They are altering documents right now," she said without preamble. "Jackson and 2 engineers are in the office removing timestamps from the implementation records for the patient data system. They are creating a paper trail, showing regulatory approval came before deployment, not 3 months after." My pulse quickened. "How do you know this?" I came back to get my laptop and saw them in the conference room. They did not see me. There are printouts everywhere, and they are explicitly discussing how to clean up the timeline issue before the investor call. This was not just fudging marketing materials. This was deliberate document falsification to cover up regulatory violations. If investors based their $90 million decision on this misrepresentation, the legal implications would be severe for everyone involved. "Do you have access to the original implementation records?" I asked. "Yes, I saved copies when you first flagged this as concerning. The originals clearly show the sequence implementation in January, regulatory approval not until April." "Keep those safe," I advised. "And Samantha, be careful, if they discover you have those documents." "I know," she said quietly. "I am already updating my resume." After hanging up, I turned my attention to researching Westlake Ventures, the lead investor for the Series D round. The firm specialized in late-stage health technology investments and had a reputation for thorough due diligence. Their healthcare portfolio included several companies that had successfully gone public or been acquired at significant premiums. Through LinkedIn, I discovered that the associate leading the Technova due diligence was James Wilson, a former healthcare regulatory consultant with an MBA from Wharton. His background suggested he would understand the significance of proper regulatory compliance in healthcare technology. After careful consideration, I sent James a connection request with a neutral message referencing our shared interest in healthcare technology compliance. To my surprise, he accepted the connection within hours, even at the late hour. I composed a carefully worded initial message that avoided any direct allegations. As the recently departed compliance director at Technova, I wanted to connect. If you have any questions during your due diligence process that I might provide perspective on, please feel free to reach out. This approach established contact without making specific claims that could trigger legal liability for tortious interference. The ball was now in his court to decide whether to engage further. James responded the next morning. Interesting timing with the funding round next week. Would value your perspective on their compliance infrastructure maturity. Over the next 2 days, we exchanged increasingly detailed messages. I was careful to present verifiable facts rather than interpretations, focusing on structural issues rather than specific allegations of wrongdoing. When James asked pointed questions about particular compliance certifications, I responded with factual timelines without explicitly stating they had been misrepresented to investors. The patient data handling protocols were implemented in January, I wrote. The regulatory certification process completed in April. Both dates should be documented in your due diligence materials. This approach allowed me to signal areas warranting closer scrutiny without directly alleging fraud. If the due diligence materials showed different dates, James would understand the discrepancy without me having to explicitly claim falsification. As the funding call approached, I weighed potential consequences carefully. Best case scenario, Westlake would identify the discrepancies, Technova would be forced to correct their representations, and the funding would proceed on honest terms. Worst case, Technova would discover my communication with Westlake and bring the full force of their legal resources against me for allegedly interfering with their funding. The personal stakes were enormous. A lawsuit could drain my savings, make me essentially unemployable in my field, and drag on for years. Even if I eventually prevailed, the process itself would be devastating. I consulted again with Patricia, my employment attorney, sharing my communications with James thus far. You are walking a very fine line, she warned. Factually accurate statements about documented timelines provide some protection, but Technova could still argue your intent was to derail their funding. What is my legal exposure here? I asked directly. Significant, she admitted. Their claims might not ultimately succeed, but the litigation process itself would be extraordinarily difficult for you personally and professionally. Are you prepared for that possibility? That night I had a long conversation with my sister. Unlike my attorney, she focused not on legal risk, but on ethical imperatives. If you know they are misleading investors about fundamental aspects of their business, and you remain silent, how will you feel if this funding goes through based on lies? She asked. Can you live with that knowledge? The question cut to the heart of the matter. Beyond legal calculations lay the simple truth: I knew fraud was being perpetrated and I had the power to potentially prevent it. The decision ultimately transcended career considerations or legal risk assessment. It became a question of who I was at my core and what principles I was willing to defend regardless of personal cost. That night, I made my final decision. I would not actively reach out to Westlake with explicit allegations, but I would respond truthfully to any direct questions they asked. This approach balanced my ethical obligation to prevent fraud with minimizing my legal exposure. If Technova had represented everything honestly in their materials, my inputs would cause no harm. If they had misrepresented key facts investors deserved to know before committing $90 million. The night before the funding call, I barely slept. My mind raced with contingency plans, worst-case scenarios, and second-guessing. Had I done enough? Had I done too much? Would my actions make any difference? Or had I risked my career for nothing? As dawn broke, I found a strange sense of peace in knowing I had aligned my actions with my principles, whatever the outcome. Marcus had been right about one thing. When he fired me, I was an idealist about regulatory compliance. Not because I fetishized rules for their own sake, but because I understood that in healthcare regulations ultimately protected real patients, real people, whose lives could be affected by cutting corners. I was prepared to face whatever consequences came next. The morning of the funding call arrived with a surreal normalcy. Outside my apartment window, people hurried to work, unaware of the personal drama unfolding in my life. I had prepared as much as possible, organizing my documentation chronologically and ensuring I could quickly reference any specific item if needed. At 9:15, I received a text from Samantha video call, with Westlake starting now. Full executive team plus board members present. Mood very confident. I tried to focus on ordinary tasks to manage my anxiety. I washed dishes, answered emails about job applications, and even attempted a short workout. But my phone remained within reach at all times, and I checked it compulsively every few minutes. By 10:30, with no further updates, I began to wonder if my concerns had been for nothing. Perhaps Westlake had not identified the discrepancies I had highlighted. Perhaps they did not care about regulatory compliance as much as I had assumed. Or worst of all, perhaps Technova had successfully covered their tracks, creating a coherent false narrative that even careful due diligence would not penetrate. The waiting became unbearable. I found myself pacing my apartment, rehearsing explanations and justifications to an imaginary jury, an imaginary professional ethics board, an imaginary future employer, asking why I had been terminated from Technova. At 11:42, my phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from James Wilson at Westlake and contained just 5 words. When was patient data recertification completed? My heart pounded as I read and reread the message. This was the critical issue Samantha had flagged, where documentation was being actively falsified. The actual recertification had been completed in April, 3 months after the system changes were implemented, a clear regulatory violation. I knew Technova was representing to investors that certification preceded implementation. With shaking fingers, I typed a single response, April 15th. Just the date, no commentary, no allegations. A verifiable fact that would directly contradict whatever Technova was claiming on the investor call currently in progress. After sending the text, I sat staring at my phone, half expecting an immediate response. None came. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I wondered if I had just destroyed my career for nothing if my text had been ignored or dismissed. At 12:08, Samantha texted again. Something is happening. Marcus just got a message and looks like he saw a ghost. Call paused for technical difficulties. Then, at 12:15, lead investor asked point blank about regulatory certification timeline. Marcus claimed January implementation with prior December approval. Investor said he has conflicting information. Diana trying to explain discrepancy as administrative timing issue. My pulse raced. They were being confronted with the truth in real time. The careful facade was cracking under scrutiny. At 12:23 came the message that would forever mark the turning point. Lead partner just said, "Kill the wire," and ended call. Marcus storming out, Diana in tears. Board members asking what happened. Kill the wire. 3 words that meant the $90 million transfer would not be happening. 3 words that signaled the collapse of Technova's carefully constructed house of cards. 3 words that validated my ethical stand, but also potentially sealed my fate as a target for their inevitable rage. Within 30 minutes, my phone began ringing with calls from Marcus. I did not answer. Then came calls from board members I had never been allowed to speak with directly before. I let those go to voicemail as well. Without hearing the messages, I could imagine their content demands for explanation, threats of legal action, perhaps even offers to clear up misunderstandings if I would help salvage the funding round. By mid-afternoon, industry news sources were reporting that Technova's anticipated Series D round had been unexpectedly delayed due to ongoing due diligence concerns. The company's official statement claimed they were working closely with investors to address routine questions about our regulatory framework. Samantha's insider updates painted a different picture. Total chaos here. Emergency board meeting called. Marcus blaming Diana for documentation issues. Legal team reviewing all investor communications for liability exposure. Later that evening, board has initiated independent investigation. External counsel interviewing everyone about compliance processes. Your name coming up constantly. The following day brought reports from multiple sources within Technova. Jackson, the product director who had so often dismissed my concerns, had apparently had a complete meltdown accusing Marcus of hanging him out to dry. Diana was reportedly on temporary leave. Most significantly, 2 board members had flown in for emergency in-person meetings, bypassing Marcus to speak directly with department heads. 3 days after the failed funding call, Technova issued a press release announcing a leadership transition period during which the board chairman would assume interim CEO responsibilities while Marcus took a temporary advisory role. The corporate euphemisms did little to disguise the fundamental reality. Marcus had been effectively removed following the funding debacle. My phone continued to ring with calls from unknown numbers, likely attorneys or investigators trying to piece together what had happened. On the advice of my own attorney, I maintained complete silence, responding to no communications related to Technova. A week later, Westlake Ventures released a statement that they were no longer in active discussions regarding Technova's Series D round, effectively killing any hope the company had of quickly securing alternate funding. Without the planned capital infusion, Technova would be forced to dramatically reduce its burn rate, likely meaning significant layoffs and scaled-back growth plans. The vindication I felt was complex and bittersweet. I had not wanted the company to fail. I had wanted it to succeed ethically. I took no pleasure in the fact that many innocent employees would likely lose their jobs in the fallout. Yet I could not deny the sense of justice in seeing those who had deliberately misled investors and dismissed legitimate compliance concerns facing consequences for their actions. As the dust began to settle, I received one final text from Samantha, who had herself resigned during the Chaos Board investigation. Found your documentation. Every concern you raised validated. New leadership calling it a systematic failure of ethics and oversight. You were right all along, Jelena. Those words provided the first real sense of professional closure I had experienced since my humiliating escort from the building. I had been right. My ethical stance had been validated. The personal cost had been enormous, but I had maintained my integrity when it mattered most. The months following Technova's funding collapse were a time of profound personal reckoning. While industry news celebrated the dramatic fall of yet another Silicon Valley unicorn, I struggled with complex emotions about my role in the company's downfall. There was vindication, certainly. The board's independent investigation had confirmed every compliance concern I had raised during my tenure. But there was also grief for what might have been a company with genuinely innovative technology that could have improved healthcare coordination if built on an ethical foundation. Most surprisingly, I experienced periods of irrational guilt. Despite knowing I had done the right thing, I could not help but think about the employees who lost jobs in the subsequent layoffs, many of whom had no knowledge of the executives' deceptions. Technova ultimately reduced its workforce by 40% as it scrambled to extend its runway without the expected funding. The healing process began slowly. I started seeing a therapist specializing in workplace trauma who helped me recognize the signs of moral injury I had experienced while being forced to choose between my ethics and my job security. She helped me understand that my feelings of guilt were misplaced. The responsibility for Technova's collapse lay with those who had chosen deception, not with the person who had refused to participate in it. 3 months after the funding collapse, news broke that the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a formal investigation into Technova's representations to investors. Shortly after, the Office of Civil Rights, which enforces HIPAA regulations, announced its own investigation into the company's handling of protected health information. Marcus and Diana both resigned from the company as these investigations intensified. Industry sources reported they had engaged criminal defense attorneys specializing in securities fraud and regulatory violations. The board installed an entirely new executive team with explicit mandates to cooperate fully with investigators and implement rigorous compliance controls. 6 months after my departure, I received an unexpected email from James Wilson, the Westlake Ventures analyst. He asked if I would be willing to meet for coffee now that the immediate situation had resolved. After consulting with my attorney, who advised the meeting would be acceptable as long as I discussed only publicly known information, I agreed. At a quiet cafe near Union Square, James thanked me for my courage in providing the critical information that had prevented his firm from making a disastrous investment. That single date you texted me saved Westlake $90 million, he explained. When I asked our technical team to verify implementation timelines, they found evidence of the backdating almost immediately once they knew where to look. I was just doing what I felt was ethically necessary, I replied. James nodded. The tragedy is that Technova had genuinely valuable technology. With proper compliance infrastructure and honest leadership, we would have happily made that investment. His words confirmed what I had always believed: ethics and business success were not inherently opposed. Technova had failed not because it prioritized compliance, but because it had treated compliance as an obstacle rather than a foundation for sustainable growth. As news of the Technova situation spread through industry circles, something unexpected happened. I began receiving inquiries from companies specifically seeking compliance expertise from someone with demonstrated ethical backbone. One CEO told me bluntly, "We want someone who will tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear before it becomes a crisis." After careful consideration of several opportunities, I declined traditional employment offers and instead established my own compliance consulting practice focused on early-stage healthcare technology companies. My mission became helping startups build ethical foundations from the beginning, integrating compliance into their DNA, rather than treating it as a checkbox for investors. My first client was a promising healthcare AI startup, founded by physicians who explicitly sought my help because they had read about the Technova case. "We want to do this right from day one," the founder told me. "We need someone who understands both the letter and spirit of healthcare regulations." Working with companies at the formation stage proved far more satisfying than trying to retrofit compliance onto organizations with already established patterns of corner cutting. I found founders generally receptive to building proper structures when presented as competitive advantages rather than obstacles to growth. 1 year after leaving Technova, I received an email from Ryan Parker, the former COO, who had warned me about Marcus's plan to replace me. He had landed at a new company after several months of unemployment and wanted to meet. Over lunch, he shared his perspective on Technova's collapse and his own role in it. "I was complicit through my silence," he admitted. "I saw what was happening, but told myself it was not my department, not my problem. I convinced myself I was just being a team player." His candor was refreshing, and I found myself able to offer genuine forgiveness for his part in what had happened. "We all make compromises," I told him. "The important thing is learning where to draw the line." "That is what I admire about what you did," he said. "You knew exactly where your line was and refused to cross it regardless of the consequences." Perhaps the most meaningful reconnection came from various former Technova employees who reached out over time. Some had found new positions, others were still searching, but many expressed similar sentiments. They had suspected problems, but felt powerless to address them. And my actions had ultimately been necessary, if painful. Samantha and I maintained our friendship, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss our new professional paths. She had joined a well-established healthcare company with a strong ethical reputation. "I sleep better at night," she told me during one of our meetings. "I will never again work somewhere that treats compliance as an inconvenience." As my consulting practice grew, I began speaking at industry conferences about ethical compliance in rapidly scaling companies. I never mentioned Technova specifically honoring the confidentiality agreements I had signed, but I drew on the experience to illustrate the dangers of treating compliance as window dressing rather than integral to business strategy. The greatest personal growth came from recognizing that my self-worth was not defined by a single company or role. The experience had forced me to clarify my own values and recognize that professional success without ethical integrity was ultimately hollow. One day, reading an industry newsletter, I came across a small announcement that Technova, now under completely new leadership and with restructured governance, had secured a modest funding round to continue development of its core technology. The company was described as emerging from a comprehensive compliance overhaul with renewed commitment to ethical business practices. Rather than bitterness, I felt a surprising sense of closure. The technology that could genuinely help patients might survive now, built on a more sustainable foundation. The experience had been painful for everyone involved, but perhaps necessary for the creation of something better. Looking back on the entire experience, the lesson I carry forward is that ethical choices may come with difficult short-term consequences, but they are the only foundation for lasting success and personal peace. True compliance is not about checking boxes or creating the appearance of propriety. It is about building organizations that create value honestly and sustainably. For anyone facing similar ethical crossroads in their professional lives, I would offer this hard-won wisdom. Your integrity is the one thing no one can take from you, but that you can give away. Guard it carefully because, once compromised, it is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. Have you ever faced an ethical dilemma in your workplace? Did you speak up or stay silent? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing a similar situation right now. And if you found value in my journey, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need to hear that standing for what is right is worth it, even when it comes at a personal cost. Thank you for listening, and remember that in the long arc of your career, integrity remains your most valuable asset.